On a Friday afternoon in July of 2022, a curator named Frances Fowle was standing in a queue at a fish shop in Edinburgh when her phone buzzed with a text message. It was an X-ray image sent by a colleague at the National Galleries of Scotland, and it showed the unmistakable outline of a bearded man in a brimmed hat, staring out from behind layers of glue and cardboard that had been sealed onto a canvas for over 100 years. The painting on the front of that canvas was a small, unassuming portrait called Head of a Peasant Woman, painted by Vincent van Gogh in 1885. Nobody at the museum had any reason to think there was a second picture attached to it. The scan had been ordered as a routine step before a loan, nothing more dramatic than checking for structural damage. Then the image loaded on the screen, and there he was, looking straight out of the darkness at the very people who had catalogued his work for 6 decades without ever suspecting he was there. Fowle would later describe it as the most exciting text message of her career, received while she was doing something as ordinary as waiting in line for dinner, which is its own small detail worth keeping in mind. Discoveries like this one rarely arrive during some dramatic, focused search. They arrive sideways, in the middle of an unrelated errand, while a museum is simply doing its paperwork. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The painting had belonged to the National Galleries of Scotland since 1960, a gift from the Edinburgh lawyer Alexander Maitland and his wife Rosalind, and in the 62 years since, it had hung on gallery walls, travelled to loans, appeared in catalogues, and been examined by generations of conservators without anyone suspecting what was sealed against its back. The X-ray taken that summer was not part of any dramatic new investigation into the artist. Conservators were simply preparing Head of a Peasant Woman for an upcoming exhibition on Impressionism at the Royal Scottish Academy, titled A Taste for Impressionism, and a standard technical scan before a work travels is meant to catch structural weaknesses, old repairs, tears in the canvas, cracks in the ground layer. What it caught instead was a face that had not been seen by anyone since sometime in the 1880s, a face that had been sitting quietly behind a painting millions of people had already walked past without knowing it was there. To understand how a second Van Gogh painting ended up hidden on the back of a first one, it helps to understand exactly how little money the artist had for most of his working life, and how late he came to painting at all. Before he picked up a brush seriously, Van Gogh had already failed, by his own estimation, at several other careers, as an art dealer's assistant in The Hague and London, as a school teacher in England, and as an evangelical preacher among coal miners in the Borinage region of Belgium, a posting that ended when church authorities decided his approach was too extreme, even for missionary work among the desperately poor. He did not commit himself fully to painting until his late 20s, and he arrived in the small town of Nuenen in the southern Netherlands in December of 1883, still entirely dependent on a monthly allowance sent by his younger brother Theo, an art dealer working in Paris, who would go on to fund nearly every remaining year of Vincent's life without ever seeing much financial return on the investment. Theo's support was not simply financial. The two brothers exchanged letters constantly, sometimes several times a week, and Vincent used that correspondence as a kind of working notebook, describing paintings before he made them, arguing with himself about color and composition in real time, and occasionally sketching a small version of a canvas directly into the margin of a letter, so Theo would know what he was talking about. It is largely because of that habit that scholars can date so much of his output with unusual precision, matching finished paintings against the letters that describe them being planned or completed. A canvas that never appears in any letter, painted quietly on the back of another study with no mention to anyone, sits outside that entire system of cross-reference, which is part of why the Edinburgh self-portrait had no paper trail leading anyone toward it before the X-ray did. Nuenen is where Van Gogh decided, with the kind of total, almost combative conviction that ran through everything he did, that he would become a painter of peasant life. He filled notebook after notebook with drawings of weavers bent over their looms, women digging in the fields, farmhands eating in cramped, lamplit rooms. In his letters to Theo from this period, he wrote about wanting to paint peasants the way peasants actually looked, not idealized or prettified for a Parisian drawing room, but built from the same rough, heavy material as the soil they worked and the potatoes they ate. He was reading widely, thinking about French writers like Zola and Millet's peasant paintings, and trying to work out, largely alone, what an honest picture of rural poverty should look like on canvas. Between 1884 and 1885, he produced dozens of head studies of local villagers who agreed to sit for him, usually in exchange for a few coins and the mild novelty of being looked at so intensely by a strange, intense Dutchman with paint permanently under his fingernails. Most of these studies were preparation for the painting he considered his first real achievement, The Potato Eaters, finished in the spring of 1885, a dark, densely worked group portrait of a peasant family sharing a meal by lamplight. He worked and reworked the composition obsessively, producing sketch after sketch of individual heads before ever attempting the full scene, sometimes painting the same sitter 3 or 4 times to get the angle of a jaw or the fall of light across a forehead exactly right. Head of a Peasant Woman belongs to that same body of preparatory work, one face among many he studied that year, as he built toward a single finished canvas that, when he finally sent it to Theo, received a muted, uncertain response, rather than the enthusiasm Vincent had hoped for. Canvas itself was not cheap, and Theo's allowance, however generous by the standards of an unsold painter, did not stretch far enough to cover fresh material for every study Van Gogh wanted to attempt. From early in his career, he developed the habit of reusing supports rather than buying new ones, a practice documented extensively in his surviving letters, where he mentions, almost as an aside, turning an old study into something else, because he could not justify the expense of starting from a blank canvas. Most of the time, this meant painting a new composition directly over an earlier one, the way he would later, in Paris, paint the loose, sunlit brushwork of a small grass study directly on top of a somber Nuenen portrait he no longer had any use for. But there was a second method as well, one that left the earlier work completely intact rather than burying it under fresh paint. Instead of painting over the old picture, he simply turned the canvas around and used the blank side on the back. That is what happened with Head of a Peasant Woman. At some point after finishing the front of the canvas in Nuenen in 1885, Van Gogh flipped it over and painted a self-portrait on the reverse. A bearded man in a brimmed hat with a neckerchief knotted loosely at his throat, his gaze direct and unflinching, even rendered in the ghostly monochrome of an X-ray. Conservators at the National Galleries of Scotland believe this second image was painted somewhat later than the peasant study on the front, likely after Van Gogh had already left Nuenen for Antwerp and then for Paris, where his first sustained exposure to the French Impressionists in the spring of 1886 set off the fastest and most complete stylistic transformation of his career. He was suddenly surrounded by painters working in broken color and visible brushwork, meeting figures like Camille Pissarro and Paul Signac, studying briefly at the atelier of the academic painter Fernand Cormon, and buying paint from the dealer Julien Tanguy, on credit he could rarely repay in cash. If the dating conservators propose is correct, the hidden self-portrait behind Head of a Peasant Woman may be among the very earliest Van Gogh ever painted, made just as he was beginning to see color, light, and his own reflection differently than he had only months before in the Dutch countryside. The exhibition the museum was preparing for, A Taste for Impressionism, opened at the Royal Scottish Academy at the end of July that year and ran into mid-November, built around exactly the kind of stylistic transition the hidden self-portrait seemed to capture. The moment a generation of painters, Van Gogh among them, abandoned muted, tonal palettes for the broken color and visible brushwork that would define modern painting for the following decades. It was a small irony that the museum's own conservation department, working to illustrate that shift for visitors, ended up finding physical proof of it, sealed inside one of its own paintings, a Nuenen-era face on one side and a Paris-influenced face on the other, separated by nothing more than the thickness of a canvas. There is a detail in the hidden portrait that later coverage of the discovery kept returning to, because of what it implied about timing. The bearded man in the X-ray shows both ears clearly, the left one fully visible below the brim of his hat. 3 years after this canvas was likely painted, in December of 1888, Van Gogh famously cut off part of his own left ear during a breakdown following a tense stay with Paul Gauguin in Arles, an event that would go on to overshadow almost every later account of his life and appearance. If the self-portrait behind Head of a Peasant Woman really was painted in 1886, as conservators currently believe, it would show Van Gogh with both ears intact, made 2 full years before that injury, making it not only one of his earliest self-portraits, but a rare, literal record of a face the public would eventually be trained to imagine as already wounded. Senior conservator Leslie Stevenson, who was present when the X-ray image first appeared on the museum's monitors, later described the discovery as absolutely thrilling, the kind of moment conservators can spend an entire career hoping for without ever encountering. Francis Fowle called it one of the rarest events possible in the study of a major artist, the emergence of a completely unrecorded work by someone as thoroughly documented as Vincent van Gogh. That word, documented, is not an exaggeration. Van Gogh's surviving correspondence runs to well over 900 letters, most of them written to Theo, and scholars have spent more than a century cross-referencing that correspondence against nearly every known painting he produced, building a chronology detailed enough to place individual works within specific weeks of specific years, sometimes down to the particular color of light he mentioned seeing on a particular afternoon. For a completely unrecorded canvas to surface from behind an already catalogued painting, inside a National Museum collection, in the third decade of the 21st century, runs directly against the general assumption that an archive this heavily studied had nothing significant left to reveal. Nobody currently knows exactly what condition the hidden self-portrait is in, because nobody has removed the material covering it. At some point, most likely in the early 20th century, when the painting was prepared to travel for an exhibition at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, roughly 15 years after Van Gogh's death, someone applied layers of glue and mounted the canvas onto a sheet of cardboard, sealing the back permanently out of view. It was an entirely ordinary conservation decision for its time, the kind of routine reinforcement applied to countless fragile canvases before they were shipped or framed for display, meant to protect the work rather than obscure it. Whoever made that choice had no way of knowing they were sealing a second undocumented painting behind a wall of adhesive, effectively hiding it inside plain sight for more than a century, inside one of the most exhaustively studied artistic archives in the world. The painting changed hands several times after that, moving through private collections before the Maitlands acquired it and eventually gave it to the nation, and at no point along that chain did anyone think to ask what might be sitting on the other side of the canvas. X-raying a painting before it travels is not unusual, and museums have been doing some version of it since the early 20th century, mostly to check the physical health of a canvas, rather than to hunt for anything hidden underneath. Old repairs show up as denser patches. Structural cracks in the paint layer show up as fine dark lines. Tears, warping, and areas where the canvas has been relined at some point in its history all leave a signature that a trained conservator can read almost instantly. Museums have used the same basic technology to study everyone from Rembrandt to Vermeer, most often confirming nothing more dramatic than the ordinary wear a centuries-old object accumulates simply by existing that long. What made the Edinburgh scan different was not the method, which was entirely standard, but what happened to be sitting on the other side of that particular canvas, waiting for someone to point a machine at it, for reasons that had nothing to do with looking for a lost Van Gogh. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What makes this discovery even more striking is that it is not an isolated case within Van Gogh's body of work. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam already holds a small group of self-portraits that the artist painted on the reverse sides of earlier Nuenen studies, made under the same financial pressure and using the same practical solution of working on a blank back, rather than paying for new material. Across his whole career, Van Gogh painted himself dozens of times, more than almost any other major artist of his era, in part because he could not always afford to pay a model, and his own face was the one subject permanently available to him free of charge. The self-portrait behind Head of a Peasant Woman, once conservators find a way to reveal it safely, would join that same small family of reverse-side self-portraits, a group of paintings that exist only because Van Gogh, faced with the plain economics of an unsold, largely unwanted body of work, decided a rejected canvas still had one usable side left on it. Taken together, these works form a strange, quietly moving record of a man who could not afford to waste even the back of a discarded study, and who instead used that leftover surface to look at himself, sometimes more than once in a single year, during a period of his life when almost nobody else was paying attention to him at all. None of these reverse-side self-portraits were painted for an audience. Van Gogh was not building a public record of his own changing appearance the way a modern artist might treat a series of self-portraits as a deliberate project. He was working alone, mostly unseen, using whatever surface happened to be within reach, and the fact that several of these studies still exist at all is closer to an accident of storage than a decision anyone made to preserve them. Canvases got stacked in Theo's Paris apartment after Vincent's death, then passed to Theo's widow Johanna van Gogh Bonger, who spent decades quietly working to place his paintings in museums and private collections at a time when almost nobody wanted them. It was her patient, largely uncelebrated effort, carried out over the better part of 30 years, that kept these lesser, unsigned studies together long enough for later generations of conservators to eventually turn them over, or X-ray them, and notice what was on the other side. There is an earlier case from this same body of Nuenen work that shows how far this kind of investigation had already come before the Scotland discovery, and how much can be recovered even when a painting has been buried under new paint rather than simply turned around. In 2008, a research team from Delft University of Technology and the University of Antwerp, led by materials scientist Joris Dick and chemistry professor Koen Janssens, examined a small landscape study called Patch of Grass, painted by Van Gogh in Paris in 1887 and held today by the Kröller-Müller Museum in Otterlo. Conventional X-ray imaging had long shown a faint, blurred outline of a head somewhere beneath the grass and dandelions on the visible surface, but the older technology could measure only density, not color or fine detail, and for decades the shape remained exactly that, a rumor of a face rather than a picture of one, the same kind of shadow that had sat unexplained behind Head of a Peasant Woman until an X-ray finally caught it under better conditions. Dick and Janssens took a different approach. They transported the small canvas to the Deutsches Elektronensynchrotron research facility in Hamburg, where a particle accelerator normally used for physics experiments could generate an X-ray beam narrow and intense enough to measure the specific chemical elements present in each layer of paint, rather than simply registering the overall density of the material the way older radiography did. Every pigment Van Gogh used carried its own chemical fingerprint. Vermilion red was rich in mercury. Certain warm yellows and flesh tones carried antimony. A layer of white primer sitting between the two compositions showed up clearly as lead. Over roughly 2 days of continuous scanning, the team mapped the distribution of these elements across a section of canvas measuring 17.5 by 17.5 centimeters, moving the narrow beam across the surface point by point in a slow, exhaustive grid. When the resulting maps were layered together and assigned color, a face resolved out of what had been an undifferentiated shadow for more than 120 years. A Dutch countrywoman, in a dark head covering, her expression serious, her features built from the same economical, almost sculptural strokes Van Gogh used throughout his Nuenen head studies. Portable X-ray tests on several surviving paintings from that same series, each one titled some version of Head of a Peasant Woman, later turned up an identical chemical signature in their flesh tones, confirming that the woman under Patch of Grass most likely belonged to that same abandoned Nuenen project, before Van Gogh, a couple of years and one relocation to Paris later, painted a bright, color-saturated field directly across her face. Between these two cases, one painted over completely, and one simply turned around and left intact, a picture starts to form of how casually and how often Van Gogh treated his own earlier work as raw material rather than as finished achievement worth protecting. Researchers now estimate that roughly 1/3 of the paintings from his early career conceal another composition somewhere beneath the visible surface, a figure built from decades of accumulated X-ray radiography across museum collections worldwide, from Amsterdam to Otterlo to Edinburgh. Most of those hidden pictures remain exactly where the self-portrait behind Head of a Peasant Woman currently sits, sensed through a scan, confirmed to exist in outline, and not yet recoverable in any real detail, waiting on either better imaging technology or a conservation decision brave enough to risk disturbing the painting the public already knows and loves. In the meantime, the discovery has already changed how the front of the canvas gets talked about. Head of a Peasant Woman used to be a minor entry in Van Gogh's catalogue, one of dozens of similar studies from the same short, difficult stretch of his life, rarely singled out for special attention among the museum's holdings. It is now, almost overnight, one of the more discussed paintings in the entire collection, not because the peasant woman herself changed in any way, but because of what turned out to be sitting a few millimeters behind her, unrelated to her expression, her clothing, or anything Van Gogh intended viewers to notice when he painted her face in the first place. That waiting is not a small or casual matter. Removing the glue and cardboard sealing the back of Head of a Peasant Woman is not simply a question of peeling away an old layer the way one might strip wallpaper. The materials have bonded to the canvas fibers over more than a century, and any attempt to separate them risks damaging both the hidden self-portrait and the peasant study on the front, the work that has represented this painting publicly for well over 100 years, and that visitors currently know as the only image this canvas contains. Conservators at the National Galleries of Scotland have said research into a safe removal method is ongoing, without any fixed timeline, because the priority is preservation rather than speed. It is entirely possible the self-portrait will remain exactly as it is now for years to come, known to exist, visible to the public only as a ghostly monochrome image, glowing inside a specially built lightbox display beside the original. Its actual color, its actual brushwork, its actual finished character, still locked behind the same adhesive that has hidden it since roughly the turn of the 20th century. There is something worth sitting with in that gap between knowing a painting exists and actually being able to see it. For well over a century, this self-portrait was not simply unseen, it was unknown, absent from every catalogue, every scholarly survey, every careful count of how many times Van Gogh turned his own face into a subject across his short working life. Its existence changes, in a small but genuine way, the shape of a career that has already been documented down to individual weeks through 900 surviving letters. It suggests that even an archive this exhaustively studied is not necessarily finished, that the edges of what is known about a single, relentlessly self-portraying artist can still move, given the right scan on the right ordinary Friday afternoon, in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable errand to buy fish for dinner. What both paintings share, the buried peasant woman under a field of Parisian grass and the buried self-portrait behind a Nuenen peasant study, is the same plain, unglamorous motive. Neither one was hidden to conceal a secret or protect a reputation. Both were hidden because a working artist without steady income needed a usable surface and had one available, and because neither Van Gogh himself nor anyone who handled his paintings after his death in 1890 had any particular reason to think these specific pieces of canvas were worth preserving on both sides. The concealment was never intentional in the way concealment usually implies in stories about hidden paintings, the kind involving secrecy or scandal. It was simply what happens when practicality, followed decades later by an unrelated conservation decision made for an exhibition loan, accumulate on top of each other for well over a century, until a routine X-ray, taken for entirely mundane logistical reasons, happens to catch exactly what nobody was looking for. Van Gogh died in July of 1890, 37 years old, having sold almost nothing during his lifetime, and having no way to imagine that his letters, his studies, his rejected canvases, and even the blank backs of his rejected canvases would eventually be picked apart, element by element, by scientists using equipment built to study subatomic particles rather than art. He produced well over 800 paintings in barely a decade of serious practice, working at a pace that left him little time or reason to treat any single canvas, especially an unsold peasant study from a town he had already left behind, as something requiring special care. It is precisely that indifference, that practical willingness to treat an old, unwanted picture as raw material for something new, that left behind these two accidental time capsules. One has already been reconstructed in full, its colors rebuilt atom by atom in a laboratory in Hamburg. The other is still waiting, sealed under glue and cardboard in an Edinburgh museum, for the day someone finds a way to bring it fully back into view without losing what already hangs, quietly and publicly, on the other side. Museums have started to treat cases like these less as isolated curiosities and more as an argument for looking harder at collections they already believe they understand completely. The techniques involved, from synchrotron elemental mapping to the kind of routine lone X-ray that caught the Edinburgh self-portrait almost by accident, are becoming more available and more affordable, and curators who once assumed a well-documented painting had nothing left to disclose are now more inclined to ask the question anyway. Neither institution went looking for a hidden Van Gogh. The Kröller-Müller Museum was chasing an old, unresolved shadow that had shown up faintly on film for decades. The National Galleries of Scotland was simply checking a painting for damage before it left the building. In both cases, the discovery arrived as a byproduct of ordinary institutional caution, rather than the result of some dramatic hunt, which may say as much about how many more hidden paintings are still out there, sitting quietly behind their more famous faces, as anything the science itself has revealed. For now, the closest anyone can get to the hidden face in Edinburgh is the lightbox beside Head of a Peasant Woman, where visitors can stand in front of the tired, weathered features of a Dutch farm woman that Van Gogh painted almost 140 years ago, and then turn to the X-ray beside it and see, glowing faintly through the same rectangle of canvas, the bearded outline of the man who painted her. Two portraits made months or years apart, welded together by a single piece of stretched linen and by a century of small, practical decisions nobody thought would matter at the time. Somewhere behind the peasant woman's steady, weathered gaze, a second gaze is still waiting, patient in a way its impatient, restless painter never managed to be in life, and for now, a glowing X-ray in a lightbox is as close as anyone can get to looking back into it. Other collections holding Nuenen-era Van Gogh paintings have since faced a version of the same quiet question the Edinburgh discovery raised. What else might be sitting, unexamined, on the reverse of a canvas nobody thought to turn over? Not every institution has the resources to run synchrotron analysis or even a thorough X-ray survey of its full collection. And not every painting from this period has an obviously suspicious shadow the way patch of grass did for decades before anyone scanned it properly. Much of what remains hidden, if anything does, will likely stay that way for a long time, simply because nobody has a specific reason yet to go looking. The same way nobody at the National Galleries of Scotland had a specific reason to expect a self-portrait until a routine loan check happened to catch one. There is no announced date for when that might change. Conservation science tends to move on a much slower clock than the news cycle that follows a discovery like this one, and the National Galleries of Scotland has been careful not to promise a timeline it cannot keep. Any future attempt to separate the cardboard and glue from the canvas will likely involve years of preliminary testing on similar materials before anyone risks touching the actual painting, and there is a real possibility that the safest option, in the end, is to leave the self-portrait exactly where it has been for over a century, protected by the very barrier that once hid it by accident. If that turns out to be the case, the lightbox will remain the only way to see him, a face known entirely through the shadow it casts, rather than through the paint itself, which is its own strange kind of survival for an artist who spent his whole short career worrying that nothing he made would last or matter to anyone at all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.